Thanks so much. Can you all see the PowerPoint? I guess you can.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Great. So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about basically an issue that I've been thinking about for quite some time now, also a project which morphed into a project on which I work in tandem with a geographer colleague called the Mitubi. And you can see the title of the talk, Lessons from the Past. So I think we can relatively safely say that that in recent years, we've seen much more attention to the pre-modern environment and its interactions with human societies, both in academic and in popular discourse. I think that understanding this trend, it might help us use history to help solve our own contemporary environmental challenges which we're facing. In my talk today, I'm going to look at the ways in which we, broadly speaking, use the past environment in the present. I'm going to start with one interdisciplinary model to using the past, the contemporary national security decision-making. And then I'm going to move to the past and see how lessons from the same event can change over time. And I'm going to use the Justinianic Plague, my expertise, as a case study. And in the next section, I'm going to examine examples of how we learn from pre-modern society environment interactions, focusing on the public, on the popular rather than the academic sphere. So mostly articles from the media, because that's where I expect to see the impacts of both high-profile academic and public or popular discourse. And finally, I'm going to summarize things up and make two suggestions for lessons from the past that I believe are not well covered in current popular public discourse. So again, I'll start off with maybe the more established way to learn from the past in national security decision-making. And I'm going to use American national security decision-making because we simply have the most evidence for that. The case study, there's a long tradition of drawing parallels between past case studies and the present within American national security decision-making. And these parallels have informed and continue to inform decision-making throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. Now, if you read the discourse, you see that most of the attention tends to focus on a few case studies. So for example, the 1938 agreement in Munich or the Vietnam War, and these derive from recent history, so to speak, mostly in lived memory or almost lived memory. And the case studies are also often discussed relatively superficially. So for example, the lesson of Munich in 1938 is that appeasement of a growing aggressive power can lead to great war or great evil. Now, the academic near consensus on this kind of learning from the past is that the decision-making that policymakers do based on lessons derived from these case studies is often not done well. And that sometimes has pretty disastrous consequences in play for policy. Okay, so that's how some people at least in the present use the past. I'm going to move on to reflect on how the past's lessons change over time, using the Justinianic Plague again as a case study. So one way to look at things would be through infectious disease broadly speaking. And if we do look at infectious diseases, the attention that we, society, or Western society, broadly speaking, gives to infectious diseases and infectious disease narratives has really changed considerably over the past century and a half, a trend that results in this map over here, as you can see, a world full of infectious diseases. Now, there are parallel changes. In my research, I discovered that there are parallel changes between what we see in academic research and the ways academic research on the infectious diseases and infectious disease narratives, and the ways in how these infectious diseases and their narratives are represented in the media and popular culture. And I'm thinking here about anything from news to film. So there's actually a feedback loop between academia and the world outside academia, especially the media, the popular culture, or public sphere, broadly speaking. Now, just as a one sentence background to the Justinianic Plague, because that's I'm going to use that as an example. So it is today, the Justinianic Plague is today perceived as a pandemic that happened around the Mediterranean and beyond, which lasted 2 centuries, broadly speaking, and killed up to 100 million people. And I'm going to problematize this a bit later on, but this is a one-sentence summary. So if we look into the past, there are actually different trends in infectious disease research which impact on the Justinianic Plague research. So the first wave of attention to the Justinianic Plague is in the context of the Bubonic Plague pandemic at the turn of the 20th century, the so-called Third Plague pandemic, somewhere around 1900, from the last decade of the 19th century into a couple of decades at least, if not more, of the 20th century. Now, studies at the time emphasized plague and its impact on humans. So studies used the Justinianic Plague to emphasize the impact on humans in the past. Once we move, and you can see an example for that on the bottom left side of the slide over here, this book by Henry Segerist that tells us that the 6th century marks a turning point in the history of the Mediterranean world. The Great Plague of Justinian appears as a demarcation line. So clearly, the Justinianic Plague is a major event in world history based on this narrative. Now, as we move on to the mid-20th century, things change. Humans, humanity, society begins to believe that we, broadly speaking, humanity has either defeated infectious diseases or is going to defeat infectious diseases in the very near future. And that leads to a minimization of plague's role in history. You can see an example of the attitude back then in this book, The Conquest of Plague. Obviously, the title of the book says a lot. And in it, Fabian Hirst tells us that victory over man's most ancient and most deadly enemy seems now to be at last in sight. So clearly, things are looking very good. They look so good, again, that reading back plague in history and trying to understand what plague used to do in history is merely glossed over. So if we take, for example, George Ostrogorsky, the eminent Byzantine historian, he writes a very influential textbook on the history of the Byzantine state. He does not refer at all to the Justinianic Plague. He doesn't even mention it. It's not even there. So, but that narrative changes as well. So if we start looking at the late 20th century, humanity actually fails to adequately deal with infectious diseases. And the two poster cases are malaria, which both sides of the Cold War actually tried to eradicate in the post-war period. So in the second half of the 20th century, invested a lot of resources and both of them were not able to eradicate malaria. And again, the failure of humanity to deal with HIV/AIDS, the HIV/AIDS pandemic at the 1980s and early 1990s. So both of these failures led to the collapse of the triumphal narrative that we saw earlier from the mid-20th century. And this also triggered another wave of attention to infectious diseases more broadly and to the resurgence of Justinianic Plague scholarship. And some of the features of the current wave of attention to infectious diseases, as I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, know in the context of COVID now, is the association of fear and dread that I guess many, all of us maybe, have felt at the beginning of COVID, and the ways in which infectious diseases are represented both in the media and also, again, in popular culture. What this graph shows us is that infectious diseases have drawn much more attention in academic publications over the past 3 or 4 decades. And this trend holds all the way until last year. So at the bottom here, we can see the years starting from 1985, going all the way till 2021. And the number on the y-axis is the number of articles, scholarly articles that are indexed in Web of Science, which is a big database of articles that have infectious diseases as their topic. So you can see that things start off pretty slow in the 1990s until the mid-1990s or so, when academic research really starts working on infectious diseases. I've added several examples of both things that are happening in the world outside academia. So the SARS or Ebola outbreaks, and some fictional cases of infectious diseases, the movie Contagion, for example. And of course, the most recent COVID pandemic that led to a real jump in the amount of attention to infectious diseases in the scholarly literature. And we can see the same thing for the Justinianic Plague. So the way to read this relatively complicated graph is from the bottom up. So here we're looking at the 17th century. You can see these are the years. And looking up all the way would move us towards the present, not entirely the present, it reaches all the way till 2019. But each of these blue circles corresponds to a study that is either on the Justinianic Plague or is important for the Justinianic Plague. The lines between them, the black lines between them, are bundled, but they're actually citations. So whoever cites, who cites who, is what you're supposed to see in this graph. which is actually interactive, but I can't run it on the PowerPoint. And what we see here is what I said earlier. So around the turn of the 20th century, this red rectangle over here, there's a significant increase in studies on the Justinianic plague. The x-axis doesn't really matter, so it's pretty random, but the y-axis does. So the years before and after 1900, compared to what happened earlier, there's much more interest in the Justinianic plague, which keeps on staying around, but really peaks over the past couple of decades, the 21st century. So although the Justinianic plague could become more or less salient over time in research based on the trends that I mentioned earlier, the perceived impacts of the Justinianic plague did expand over time. So I'm thinking here about the temporal extent. So from a point in time, or maybe a few decades to 200 years, the spatial extent, whether something that was concentrated really around the Mediterranean, or it can extend further away to Yemen, Ethiopia, Persia, Scandinavia, and of course the mortality, which over the past few decades has really reached, I mean, at least part of the scholars, at least some scholars believe that the mortality of the Justinianic plague reaches all the way above 50%, so 60% or even 70% mortality across the Mediterranean. Now, partially as a result of the expansion of these perceived impacts, scholars today profoundly disagree whether the pandemic was a major contributor to the end of antiquity or whether it was merely a footnote in history. And I think both these approaches can be seen at the bottom of the slide here. So on the left-hand side of the slide, this book from 2017, The Fate of Rome, that includes this graph that shows us that somewhere around 540, there's this major decrease in population from 30 million people in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, all the way till 15 million people. Whereas on the other hand, 2 years later, a study led by me found little evidential support for the claim that the Justinianic plague was a watershed event. We reject the current scientific consensus of the Justinianic plague as a major driver of demographic change. And there's actually no more basis for the current estimate of 50% demographic loss than we would have for a minimalist estimate of 0.1%. So I think what this shows us is that the Justinianic plague case study is different from some of the more superficial examples for national security decision-making, which tend to use case studies where there is broad agreement on what actually happened, partially because they happened in living memory. In case of the pre-modern past, we see that there is little to no such agreement. And in fact, the lessons derived from the Justinianic plague change over time based on contemporary interests and attention, while the impact or the perceived impact of the Justinianic plague change over time as well. And at the moment, they cover really a huge range of possibilities. So I'll move on from here to learning from pre-modern society environment interactions. And I think what I'm going to do here is examine general public or maybe popular discourse, mostly, not entirely, but mostly that. And I think that by doing that, we can identify some of the ways in which we, broadly speaking, use the past environment today. And we can come up with broad categories. I came up with 3. There are obviously others. It doesn't catch everything. There are lots of subcategories, which I'll touch upon a bit later. This is also a clean version. And in reality, different pieces will belong to different categories and subcategories. But I think still, if I do need to summarize things, I would point to uses of the past that underline the importance of the discipline or profession, attempts to contextualize the present using the past, and attempts to look forward using the past as well. Now, whether these are uses or misuses of the past really depends almost entirely on one's perspective and the question they're asking, as well as the time and context in which they write. Now, I'm going to use many examples in the next slides. I'm not going to critique any one of these in particular, and I tended to select examples from those case studies that I personally know best, so I'm more attuned to. Again, I'm not citing them to agree or disagree with the arguments or conclusions, but mainly to highlight the diverse ways in which the pre-modern past environment is used. So, for example, we can underline the importance, we can use the past to underline the importance of the discipline profession. For example, by emphasizing the past's relevance for the present or future. For example, here in this meeting for the Council on Foreign Relations, this speaker says that today's news guided her to the 14th century because the Dow Jones has plummeted 7%. And she goes on to realize that this epidemic is actually not end. The 14th century, of course, being a reference to the Black Death. Here again, the lessons to be learned from plagues are not merely about how many people died, but also that those who were left alive struggled as we do 2 years into the pandemic. course, waiting and dreaming for the pandemic to end. So examples. Other examples. You can also try to use the past to define rules of history. And here, for example, this piece, The Conversation. The Conversation is actually a venue that hosts academics and aims at a broad, educated audience. And I should also say that most of the pieces that I'm citing here are either written by academics and aimed at a broader audience, or are written by others who use academics, who just interview academics and talk to them about these questions. To get back to the question, here, for example, there's a rule of history. From the Black Death to COVID, pandemics have always pushed people to honor death and celebrate life. So again, trying to define these rules. We can also try to contextualize contextualize the present by joining what we perceive as important present discourse. And this tends to come more from the academic side. In this case, two books from the early 2000s refer to bioterrorism, which drew a lot of attention back then, partially because of the Iraq War, the anthrax envelope attacks in the United States. So they both talk about bioterrorism, even though the books themselves are about late antiquity, so the 5th to 8th centuries, let's say, CE. And we can also connect to climate change, for example, over here with this very influential article that the piece that came out in Science magazine, the most important general science journal. And this really received widespread attention worldwide and continues to influence people, as you can see in this other piece from The Conversation, which was published a couple of months ago. And we can use, again, the past to, the article from the previous slide, actually, the 536 being the worst year article, to make a point about the present. So here, for example, there are many different ways and cases in which we can argue that actually the year in which we're living, whether it's 2018 or 2020 or 2021 or 2022, is not that bad. And the actual worst year in history is 536. So it's, again, a way to minimize contemporary difficulties. The articles are ostensibly talking about 536, but what they're really trying to say is about their own time. Again, we can look at numbers and try to minimize the difficulties we're facing today using the past. So both these infographics tell us the same thing. I circled in red the Justinianic Plague and the Black Death. I circled in blue COVID. And what this shows us that actually, if we look historically, many more people died in the Justinianic Plague and the Black Death than in COVID. And that's why COVID is not as serious. I mean, this is what this is trying to tell us, at least historically. We can also try to highlight the origins or early manifestation of an aspect of a present issue. Here, for example, just like COVID-19, the Black Death also had its own quote-unquote truther movement. Just like COVID-19, the Black Death also had persecution of minorities. So again, we call attention to that. We can highlight the superiority of science. Here, for example, using DNA evidence to find the cause of the Black Death. But the story here is really about the achievements of science, being able to answer all these questions that we were not really able to know or answer in the past. We can also try to look forward and predict future trajectories. So both pieces at the top here were published during COVID, early during COVID, when some of us were still more optimistic. And both pieces argue that COVID was going to reduce inequality, argument made by classical historian Walter Scheidel, using, among others, data from the Black Death. Of course, in retrospect, that did not turn out to be the case. And as you can see here at the bottom, article from about a month ago, COVID has actually made global inequality far worse. And if things are bad in the present and our predictions don't work as well as we would have hoped, we can collectively still hope for a better future in a few decades, as these pieces tend to do. So they tie between the Black Death and here, for example, the demise of feudalism, or here as the Black Death leading to the Renaissance. And I think what the pieces are supposed to imply, they use the past to imply that maybe COVID will also have a so-called happy ending if we look retrospectively, maybe a couple of decades, more decades, a century, or even several centuries back from the future. So I'm going to summarize things up, and to bring the different pieces of the talk back together. I think that since the past is constantly changing, there are many different ways in which we can use it. We've seen there is this sharp increase in both public, popular, and scholarly attention to the pre-modern environment over the past decade, but still, it's still far less salient compared to the model use of the past that we saw through national security decision-making, which I started with. Now, there are two key reasons for this discrepancy that I believe at least. One is that the pre-modern environmental past is far less known compared to the more recent present. And the other is that discourse about the pre-modern environment has yet to coalesce around a few dominant narratives. So the both popular, public, and academic attention is still pretty scattered. I'm going to present two alternative stories very quickly that we can tell about the past that are still very relevant to our times. One of these is going to be about sustainable resource management. Obviously, there's a constant challenge in running a state to have enough resources available to maintain the state and its institutions. But ancient societies, broadly speaking, in general, were able to do so. I'll cite a case study by Benjamin Graham and Ray Van Dam about the case the wood and woodland used by large ancient cities. They work on Rome. You can make a similar argument for Constantinople. Both of these cities and several others in antiquity housed hundreds of thousands of people who used wood on a daily basis as a fuel for heating or cooking, and they needed constant supply of this resource. The problem is how to not exhaust woodland resources, especially because doing so would simply increase costs over the medium and long term because of transportation. But this seems like a success story. So aiming for something like this, a sustainable economy with sustainable resource management, is a lesson we can convey and should maybe learn, I believe should, learn from the past. And the other case study is how to mitigate an unpredictable environment. So here again, ancient social systems included redundancies in all levels, from resources to administrative position. These redundancies, from a modern perspective, seem as inefficiencies. And why do they need so many people to do the same thing? But in reality, these served as buffers to mitigate the effects of an unpredictable natural environment and the serious limitations of pre-modern management. The case study here I'm thinking about is food production, food shortages. Peter Garnsey's seminal study. Peter Garnsey uses early 20th century data to argue that wheat in ancient Attica, Athens, failed about once every 4 years on average. And some of the places that supplied Athens with food on the Black Sea coast, in about half the years, they had a deficient wheat harvest. So despite these standard regular shocks and the many other extreme events, earthquakes, diseases, wars, and so on, pre-modern societies persisted. And I think this is, again, another lesson we could and should employ for the future. So in the talk, I've looked at the different ways in which we use the past, some of the challenges and how we do that. And we finished with a couple of alternative stories that are relevant to our times and future in light of our, again, contemporary environmental challenges. So thanks a lot for your attention. Looking forward to the Q&A at the end of the session.